Hello and welcome to VarnVlog, and today we're rejoined by Brandon Lightly, and we're going to talk about Maoism.
The most fun and complicated thing to talk about, I think any
Yeah,
Marxist in the West could ever do.
Marxist anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
like unless you're living in China and then just like, okay, Maoism is whatever the Bureau of the PRC says it is, the CPC, consensus line. Maoism is a contested and complicated history, and I'm going to just put it out here and say, even though we're only dealing with two elements of it, it's an internal critique of Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that I think it's debatable. And I know this is people are going to go nuts how Marxist it is in its assumptions. Like, I saw people lose their shit when Black Redguard, our DSA's foreign Christopher, said that Maoism was, like anarchism for Marxist. And I'm like, well, the reason why that isn't as insane as it sounds like, is that Maoist actually tended to agree with platformist and
Mm-hmm.
Zapatistas, like not modern Zapatistas. I mean, Zapatistas in the Mexican Revolution and a few other groups, that the peasantry was the most revolutionary class because of the task at hand. And that the proletariat would catch up later, although they are still Marxists in the sense that they ultimately the proletariat's probably the more important class, although Mao's writings on this actually contradict themselves. So I'm not even going to get into that. And this is not even getting into the fragmentation of Maoism after the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Because Maoism starts to fragment pretty thoroughly, both because of the divisions it causes within the official, formally common form aligned communist parties, which all split basically immediately over this stuff, more than even Trotskyism. I mean, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Trotskyists got kicked out, but the Maoists caused these parties to split. But two, and I think also more importantly, even Maoists amongst themselves differ dramatically on what they believe. So if you're a Dungist or a Dungjiist, which are not the same thing, despite the fact that they're often presented the same,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're a classical Mao Zedong thoughtist, or if you're Marxist internationalist.
Are there any MIM people left?
There are third worldists left. I don't know if there are MIM people all that left. I mean, there are MLM people, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to do a quick breakdown just so people know.
Yeah, this is
Because
actually
some
good
of
with Maoism. Yeah, because there's just so
oh,
many.
yeah, I mean, Trotskyists are interesting because the tendencies are named after who founded them. So you have like Marxism, Cliffordism, Grant slash Woodsism, which is basically the one that survived the most,
Mm-hmm.
admittedly, et cetera, et cetera. And I could go into the differences, but usually there are about two things: how you handle imperialism, how you handle the West, and what you think makes the Soviet Union questionable. Those were the divisions in Trotskyism. In Maoism, it's weirder because they're not necessarily, with the exception of Shining Path Galanzoists, named after leaders of tendencies that split. They're named after completely different theoretical assumptions. So you have Mao Zedong thought, which is classical Maoism, but it asserts that classical Maoism is correct for China and countries that are at the same development level as China, but not most countries, not even most countries
Yeah.
in the developing world. Then you have Marxist-Leninist Maoism, who asserts that, yes, it is appropriate for everybody, regardless of where they're at. Then you have the various forms of third worldism, Marxist internationalist movement, or the Marxist internationalist Maoism. I've actually seen it called both. I don't know which is correct. Which led to various forms of third worldism, which have various degrees of the first world proletariat as an enemy. And how much of an enemy varies by individual actually pretty greatly, and what they think that the first world proletariat should do varies pretty greatly amidst different theorists, but that's another tendency. One that seems to be based off of literally a misunderstanding of a translation of the Three Worlds speech, but which is often attributed to Lin Biao, but may not be. Lin Biao's ideas. I've read now more and more about this, and I'm like, I don't know.
It does seem like there is almost in the same way that like proletarian nations kind of like independently popped up in multiple areas. It does seem like third worldism in some respects popped up in multiple different areas with completely different justifications and like frameworks for understanding what they were. I mean, I know in the European context, like European third worldism developed as a like metaphor for the estates system again. And that's just like not at all what third worldism as we're talking about today is even like kind of related to, but that language is seeped into it in some ways. And
people might be going, why are you discussing this? Because you're only discussing the mass line and New Democracy. Well, some of these movements actually, even though they're Maoist, reject New Democracy in particular. The only thing that I think we can say all Maoists share is the mass line. And what they mean by that is going to be different. It is thrown around a lot without a lot of people understanding what it is. Like when I first heard the mass line, I remember reading Norman Finkelstein talking about why he gave up being a Maoist.
I never realized Norman Finkelstein was a Maoist. That's interesting.
Yeah, back in the day, like a long time ago. Like
gotcha. Okay.
Like before he was finished. This is like in the 70s.
Okay.
And he talked about the mass line and he made it sound like it was just like populism. And a lot of left populism comes out of Eurocommunism and Mao spandex because I think it's a misunderstanding of the mass line. But okay, you might go, Varn, whatever. What does this have to do? Well, we kind of have to get into this. I mean, one of the things that we need to talk about the mass line is in 1961, Mao criticized Joseph Stalin for two things. One is killing too many communists. I know, surprising. The most large tradition of Marxist-Leninist actually agreed with Khrushchev on this point. Before you guys go, they hated the secret speech. They thought that Khrushchev threw out the baby with the bathwater, but Mao actually agreed with Khrushchev that the purges killed too many communists and too many innocent people in general, and that the Soviet Union had crushed the peasantry way, way, way too much. That the anti-Kulak campaigns were unnecessary. He says this explicitly in 1961 in a speech called A Critique of Soviet Economics, which you can find printed in full from Monthly Review Press. It was printed in 1977 in English. And he also did this after the anti-rightist campaigns, which I don't want to get into the 100 Flowers campaign and the anti-rightist campaign, which some people see was a bait and switch. I want to get into all that today. I don't know that it was or it wasn't. Then in the 16 Articles in 1966, Mao eulogized mass action and the end of mass politics in the Soviet Union and called for it to return, which is basically what kicks off both the collective period and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And this leads to reinterpretations of the mass line in 1966. But we're kind of starting at the middle end. So let's go back to the beginning. I'm going to start with what the mass line is. And you read a bunch of articles. I read a bunch of articles. And I went back and read all my history of the Chinese Communist Party to make sure that I knew what the hell I was talking about. In terms of what this meant in China. Now, we can talk about what this has meant outside of China in these various other Maoist tendencies. But we need to talk about it specifically as a kind of result of the limitations of the specific United Front with the Kuomintang that happened in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
And then how Mao concretized this during the Civil War.
Yeah.
After the Long March. And go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, actually, because we've been talking about the United Fronts and the Popular Fronts. This is the first United Front is a popular front or a national front in all respects.
Yeah.
But it was called a United Front just because of translational work. They wanted to literally be more united, and the word Popular Front was more of like a revolutionary term. I think like Lyman van Slyke writes about this, but
yeah,
that's why
also
it's called the United
Front.
That's why China called it the United Front, even though it is a popular front.
Right. Also, Popular Front wasn't acceptable in Marxist language. It was considered a revolutionary term, but a bourgeois revolutionary term.
Yes.
Until 1937. And the first United Front predates that, so they couldn't call it a popular front, even though that's effectively close to what it was. And it turns out terribly for the Chinese communists because they get massacred by the White of the Kuomintang, which starts off the Civil War. I just like really, like slimming down 10 years of history very quickly. But so I'm going to talk about what the mass line is, because I don't think it's not just populism. There's a 3-step process here. We'll talk about its philosophical foundations, and then we'll go back and talk about its history. So, like, the mass line is an operational cycle. Now, the masses includes, depending on the time period of which you are talking about in Chinese development, the popular classes, which is often code for the non-reactionary petite bourgeois, left nationalists, which isn't really a class, but they're often included in this, the peasantry, and the agrarian and industrial proletariat. When we get to New Democracy, we will include the non-comprador national bourgeoisie, highly, highly controversially. But this is who the mass line is. And the peasantry is in the forefront, but Mao says this is because of specific historical conditions of China, where feudalism is even less thrown off than it was in Germany, which was also something that we were debating about, because they hadn't really got rid of the younger class and all that either in Germany at the time, the beginnings of Marxism.
This is actually, I feel like this is where I fell down the rabbit hole pretty far. Specifically in regards to, I mean, we've talked about how like Maoism is like an internal critique of Marxism, but it's also a critique that's been there since the beginning. I'm not like really a late Marx, early Marx kind of person, but I will say it does seem like late in Marx's life, he did have a bit of a change of heart when it came to Russia and the peasant commune system, the like Orshina, I believe.
The Orshina, and this is known from the drafts. I'm going to say this because actually the letter that was sent is much more pared down. From the drafts of the Vila Sasulik letters, which everybody makes a lot of hay with. But he does seem to argue that if you have the development of the core countries, that the peasantry, if they had a collective system of organization, could basically leapfrog over that development. So that development had to happen. but you don't have to necessarily, according to Marx, go through industrial development, which again, neither Lenin nor Plekhanov really even knew about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe like Lauren Goldner in their book like Revolution Defeat Theoretical Underdevelopment. I have a lot of like it's a fine book. I think people should read it, but
It
yeah.
is ultra. It's ultra
Yeah,
leftist.
yeah, but they do. Lauren points out that like Engels, in certain ways, did actually suppress some of this like later Marx work, even though like their drafts and stuff, because he was just mad that Marx decided to get a special interest on Russia instead of finishing Capital.
Yeah. People think it's because he wanted to suppress what Marx was saying. It's like, no, he's not trying to do that. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it was suppression. I think it was just, again, these are letters. This is oh my gosh,
Sasulik.
Sasulich. Yeah, that letter, like, it's a few letters. There are a lot of Marx letters.
Also, Sasulich is an interesting character because she's also important in the history of Bakunin.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, just as fun little notes of revolutionary historical people that end up having like a weird get referenced a lot, and you're like, who the fuck is this person? I don't know anything about her, but I sure know that everybody was writing her fucking letters.
Yeah, everybody was fucking talking to her.
Anyway, so and this is actually part of like there is a justification that came actually after the fact. The other thing that I learned from reading Mao's biography that Mao was very conversant in Marx and Lenin and Stalin, but he read it backwards. So he was first conversant according to his biographer. I gotta find the specific biographer that I'm thinking about. He's a Russian guy who went through the archives. It's not the one that most Americans read, which I think is probably some like anti-Maoist piece of shit book. But
yeah, it's like Mao, the Great Killer, or whatever.
Yeah. But what's the book? It's like by Alexei something.
Alexander Pantsov.
Yes, it's Alexander Pantsov's book. And Pantsov points out that Mao is first introduced to Kropotkin, then encounters Shindu Shu, who is sort of like the Plekhanov / Trotsky of China. Although he wasn't, he also gets called a Trotskyist. It's unclear that he was actually a Trotskyist to me, at least early on. And then and Shindu Shu is one of the founders of the Chinese, one of the two founders of the Chinese Communist Party. The other guy is I keep on forgetting his name, but he's the proletarian nation simultaneous to Mussolini guy. And then Mao goes through Stalin, Lenin, and Marx kind of backwards. And he's reading them as he's developing theory and goes from being one of the most influential fighting figures in the CPC to being the leader of the CPC effectively. Now, I will say we tend to read Mao as like a unitary leader, and he was not. Like even when we talk about the mass line, it's actually debatable who first came up with it. Mao's the person who refined it, but it's attributed to both Li Lishan and Zhou Enlai. And no one, I mean, literally, I can't find anything, even translations of Chinese texts, that can settle the matter of who came up with it first. It seems to have been something that they discussed as early as the 1920s, but doesn't get codified until the 1940s. So let's talk about what it is. All right. The mass line is not an event. It is not populism. It is not everyone gets a vote. It is a leadership feedback loop. It goes upon a fairly strict 3-step process. The party has its cadres. It sends its cadres out to collect all the scattered and unsystemic ideas, grievances, and local knowledge of the general population, as per what Lenin said to do. when Lenin talks about this in terms of understanding the classes and understanding hegemony, we always think about this because Gramsci's the one writing about it. He writes about it in terms of like figuring out cultural hegemony as a means of ideology. But this is the origins of the first step of the mass line. You go out, you talk to the people being the popular classes, and just to remind people of who that is, according to Mao, that's the peasantry, the industrial proletariat, the agrarian proletariat, the petite bourgeoisie under a certain amount, and like this was like strictly limited and codified. Who it isn't is landlords and the comprador bourgeoisie, and landlords are a bigger deal in China because of their state of development. And the comprador bourgeoisie is a concept that comes in from the national fronts and national liberation movements that is not inherent to Marxism. The comprador is a word from Portuguese, and it referred to business leaders who were indigenous, local to the area, but not necessarily indigenous, because not like Chinese people, the Han aren't necessarily indigenous to every area of China they're at either. And who would cooperate with the foreign capitalist powers, particularly the Portuguese, which is where comprador comes from. And so people will throw this around after the New Left happens because all this stuff gets intermixed. You know, we sometimes see Trotskyists talk about comprador bourgeoisie. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool and all, and it is helpful. Although the love of the national bourgeoisie is weird, particularly if you take some of the MLMs and like talking about national bourgeoisie in the developed world as being good, because I'm like, that's some of the most reactionary elements that you have.
Yeah, that is.
But Mao did not say that people in America should do this, so let's just give him the credit where it's at. He's talking about trying to overthrow feudalism and set up a control form of basically capital development super quickly and bypassing the need for capitalism through this mass line. So you have the gathering from the masses, then the party goes through and systemically studies everything that they get, but they check it through the lens of Marxist-Leninism, going through the various codified forms of Marxism that they've come up with, as modified by the Chinese party at this point. Initially, it was not modified by the Chinese party. Initially, it was according to the Comintern. And this is to turn them into systemic and concentrated ideas, which is the vanguard element of it. And then you return to the masses, where you take these policies to the people, explaining and popularizing them, relying on the fact that you got the information from them, from the people themselves, and then you try to put them into action.
It seems to me a lot of people see the mass line as steps 1, and that's it. Is go to the people and hear their complaints, and then the party should do that.
Yeah.
That's overwhelmingly at least been my been my experience with people talking about the mass line in left spaces.
Yeah, because they don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, in some ways, like, this is gonna sound crazy because we're eventually gonna talk about ultra left and left communist responses to all these lines, but like, this notion of party is remarkably similar to Bordiga's, except Bordiga doesn't give a shit about the peasants or the petite bourgeoisie. Like, that's what he thinks the party should do with the working class, and that's why he also thinks that, like, we shouldn't fight factions and have faction bans, because if your party had gotten the systemic line right, you wouldn't need it anyway. That the existence of factions shows the incompleteness of the party's ability to understand what they need to do, and that basically organically this would resolve itself. This is where the organic centralism stuff comes. It's weird, but like, I'm trying to explain it in the most charitable way possible. We'll come back to that because it's going to be important when we talk about left communist responses to all this.
Yeah,
but this isn't that different from that. Like, the idea is the party is using theory to take what the masses want and give it to them, but in a way that promotes the agenda of socialism without merely being tailist. Now, we're to come back to this because one of the most common disparagements of the mass line is that it's tailist and class collaborationist. And to some degree, it is. But a lot of people point out that's not the major problem with it. Like a lot of articles that you gave me were talking like, well, actually this middle processing part's where a whole lot of stuff can go really strange.
Yeah.
But what are the philosophical foundations for it? Because one of the things that makes Marxism unique, as stated by Alvin Golder, is we are the only people that really take our governing philosophy so seriously that we govern by it.
Truly.
Like,
yes.
Like we're it. Like liberals don't actually govern by liberal theory. Like,
no. It's gotten so bad within liberal circles that people will call just governing by liberal theory socialism at this point.
Yes, exactly. She's just like, okay. Thank you, populist.
Yeah.
For those of you who
good
don't
work,
know,
everybody.
I hate populism more than probably anything else.
Pre-order Varn's book, by the way.
Yeah. A book where I talk about with General Tut why I hate populism for 60 pages. I also give some positive stuff that people can do. But anyway, mostly it's why I hate. Tut adds all the sophisticated psychoanalytical stuff to it. I'm more just like, this is the stats, people. So I know this is gonna sound weird, but the mass line is two things. It is both an operational principle and it's an epistemological gambit. And that latter part's interesting to think about. So what's the epistemological gambit? Because this is not true for the Popular Front and the United Front. The Popular Front and the United Front aren't using this tactic as a way to get ideas processed in the party. That's not what they're doing. Like, they have other stuff. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this as a baseline more is because everyone agrees the United Front and the Popular Front are strategies and tactics. This is a strategy, a tactic, an operational principle, and a philosophical principle. And it is unique to Maoism in terms of Marxism. But what undergirds it is not. One of the things that I want to say as we talk about this, I do think most of the elements of the mass line have some basis in like minor writings by Marx or Engels or Lenin. What I do not think is that they're put together that way by any of those people. So I say this because old Maoists used to admit that this was a philosophical innovation. New Maoists will kind of somehow claim that this is just like standard, obvious, like Marxism and Marxist-Leninism, and I beg to differ. It is not.
And and in doing so as well, these Maoists will also tend to almost dumb down what the mass line is in order to make it less innovative, less new, like less of an innovation, so that they can fit within the like regular Marxist circles. Right. Which I think is probably a mistake.
Yeah. I actually kind of admire the mass line, even though I would not include all the classes that they include in it. But as a way of like both giving people what they want, but trying to keep it along a socialist line instead of just like random ad hoc policies like fucking populists do. Look at
and
Bernie.
This is the problem of reformism: is you just fall into the reformist trap and lose your maximalist vision.
Right.
And this is at least an attempt to answer or address that contradiction.
Right. And it's a process as opposed to whatever the transitional program was.
Yes.
In Trotskyism, for people who don't know what that is, that was their answer to the min-max problem. So this is an answer. It's like, no, we still have a minimum program. We still have a maximum program, but we are processing this to pull this through those two things, both the maximum and the minimum program, are constantly shifting with material conditions and class needs. That's the idea. And I don't think this would be controversial in Marxism, except that early Maoism puts the peasantry in charge. So that's where things get different. However, as the communization theorists will point out, maybe Maoist had a point, because the peasantry actually did have revolutions that the industrial proletariat in the developed world didn't. And that wasn't just in Asia. All right, so the philosophical foundations. One is the theoria versus praxis distinction from Marx, a la Moses Hess, a la Aristotle. Well, excuse me. From Marx, a la Moses Hess, a la Hegel, a la Aristotle. Let me get the lineage correct. Although in the Maoist tradition, and I sometimes sound like I'm being like condescending here, but since a lot of the people that Mao was working with were very smart but otherwise illiterate peasants who knew Taoism more than they knew like European philosophy, Mao will express this stuff at least when it is translated into English in ways that seem remarkably simplistic and almost like Taoist folk magic, which is sometimes what I accuse vulgar Maoism of being. It's just taking like very simple statements made by Mao to the peasantry, and like, this is it, like, we have the contradiction and we live in contradiction, and I'm like, that's not what Marxism is or what dialectic is, but whatever, man. But I do think part of that, if you read like different Mao texts, depending on what, like, who he's talking to, you will get a vast difference in sophistication, and that's from Mao himself. Unlike Soviet texts, which often always read like stereo instructions, I actually appreciate that Mao's theoretical texts are actually aimed at different levels of people.
It's something that Mao had mastered that a lot of people still fail to master today, myself included.
Yeah. I once had a conversation with Daniel. I've had many conversations with Daniel Tiny. He's talking about expressing stuff to the masses, and I'm like, I'm not against using complicated language with relatively uneducated people, as long as they are willing to ask me what it means and spend time to explain it. But sometimes I'm like, we don't need to speak to everybody like we're fucking professors. It really is not helpful. But anyway, so you have the theory versus practice thing. And the idea is like the theoria needs to come from the praxis itself. But where do you find the praxis? Well, in the struggles of the popular classes, particularly the peasantry and the proletariat. So we need to look and study the actual social practices, labor practices, class struggles, scientific experiments, etc., going on within the proletariat within a certain nation. And this is a thing, the Maoism, more than other forms of communism, is nationally bound. Yes, nationalism is part of all forms of communism, sort of a whole different debate. But
we're not going to mention Otto Bauer this episode. We're not going to mention him.
We're not going to go into Otto Bauer. We're not going to go into Rosa Luxemburg.
No.
Or Anton Pannekoek or Bordiga. But anyway, or the fact that Marx seems to be all over the place himself on the national question.
Yeah.
But anyway, the other thing that it does is, despite the fact that Maoists are often seen as being more cult of personality driven than even most normal Marxist-Leninist, aka Stalin promoters, this actually does reject the great man theory of history, even though it is still, you still have the cults of personality that Maoist parties are given to, which is that the people and the people alone are actually the motivating force of history. I mean, Mao says that explicitly. I think the quote from Mao translated into English, and I'm not going to try to say anything in fucking Mandarin. So, the people and the people alone are the motive force in the making of world history. So this is a collectivist notion, and I have actually pointed out that for all my problems of what China did during the Sino-Soviet split, some of which I find kind of hard to forgive, they actually did take some elements of Marxism a little bit more seriously than the Soviets. And I know that in and of itself is going to kind of surprise some people. The other thing was that Maoism is anti-bureaucratic. And part of the reason Maoists thought things got so violent in the Soviet Union were internal struggles against bureaucracy. Which had to be dealt with through things like the Yuzovchina and the Red Terror and they thought that this led to the killing of way too many comrades and way too many innocent people. And while people can talk about Mao's death tolls, what you won't find even in the Cultural Revolution, it's not that they didn't do executions, they did. But executions were harder to do. They had a stricter grounds, and a lot of the killings were actually suicides. They were honor suicides. They were not or they happened in street battles. They were not, taking people out back and shooting them in the head en masse.
Yeah.
Which did happen in the Soviet Union, no matter how you cut it. This was a way to dialectically deal with the two problems that they saw in bureaucracy, which is commandism, which is leaders giving orders without an understanding of local reality or class needs, and tailism, which is leaders simply following the masses' ideas without providing any guidance, leading to an incoherent basket of policies that don't make any fucking sense and don't lead to socialism. That was what they were aiming to do. This is actually like a dialectical synthesis of the tailism commandism problem. Does it work? We'll come back to that because it changes meaning a lot throughout the history of China, and this is where things are going to get complicated. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I will say the question of like, does it work? We're going to come back to that, of course, but like at least during the Second United Front period, Mary Mazur has a quote that says, to individuals at the time, the United Front and then the mass line process, because the Communist Party was leading this certain front, meant both concrete discussion and action on political issues which affected their personal lives. What primarily attracted people outside the two major parties to the United Front was the practical way it addressed pressing political issues and opposed the Japanese. And so, like, this isn't just like an abstract concept. This was being on the ground. Chinese communists were like working locally, were like networking with other parties, with bourgeois parties and with liberal parties. And then they were intervening with them, co-opting them to a certain extent. But the people who were a part of them were feeling heard and feeling like things were actually being addressed compared to like the GMD or the KMT, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. The GMD, KMT, the Guomindang, Komindang, depending on how you transliterate that.
Yes, yeah. Depending on who you're reading and who you're translating.
I remember talking to one of my Chinese students about Chiang Kai-shek, and they looked at me for like a half an hour and then said it to me in their regional dialect and then in Mandarin, and I was like, that's what I mean.
Yes.
And they're like, what? I'm like, this is how we say this in English. I am deeply apologetic for the fact that I am butchering your language. But I have, yeah. And they're like, oh, you mean blah, blah, blah. I can't even remember what they said because I can't get the tones right. But it was not like, they just looked at me like I was crazy when I said Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen. They got Sun Yat-sen quicker than Chiang Kai-shek. And I don't know what the difference in pronunciation is that makes that easier to translate over. But anyway, it was this weird time where I thought I was bonding with my Chinese students at one point, and they were looking at me like I was nuts, and then they realized what I was talking about. Like, oh, you do know something, you just have no idea how to pronounce it. And I'm like, yeah. Like,
I already struggle enough with French. I'm not gonna even try to pronounce Chinese words today.
Yeah, this is the other thing, is like all the languages involved in Maoism except for Spanish and Portuguese are languages I don't speak. That's not true. I kind of speak Korean, but like, Jusei's not Maoist at all. So like at all. It was.
We're gonna put them up there. That's gonna be the last thing that we talk about.
I don't even want to deal with Jusei. Jusei's like,
yeah, I know. They're just the weird guy who like comes along for some trips and stuff, and we're just like, yeah, we're gonna point at him.
I call it Confucio, anti-Confucio Marxist-Leninism, which confuses people, but I'm like, it's both extremely Confucian and extremely anti-Confucian simultaneously. which is partly about the scholar role and the former intellectia in the class coalition, which, by the way, is in the Jusei class coalition. That's what the paintbrush is.
Mm-hmm.
Which people like, I'm like, these symbols actually represent shit, people. Like the hamstick is the peasantry and the proletariat. The united dictatorship of the peasantry of the proletariat, which becomes the dictatorship of the proletariat once you collectivize the farms and make all the peasantry into agrarian proletariat in theory, although it doesn't really work out that way.
It
just
does
really
not.
pissed a lot of people off once you got rid of Bukharin, but whatever. I'm not here to idolize Bukharin either, but he was actually pretty good at keeping the peasants involved.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, back to this. So I just want to talk about the distinctions from both populism and general democracy. One, the mass line is not a vote. It is not about majority rule. The party retains the final authority to decide what mass ideas are correct based on revolutionary theory. And while this is a democracy within the party, in theory anyway, you got to be in the party to be part of that democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It is an idea of transforming the masses by also meeting them where they're at simultaneously. It is not just populism and whatever the masses say is good. This is from the idea in Marx that the advanced sections of the proletariat are the most likely to join up and merge with the socialists. This actually is kind of a more advanced, like, working out of the merger thesis, except that it involves more classes than the merger thesis does. The merger thesis involves socialists from whatever class that they're in, and that was usually the petit bourgeois professionals at the time. And the proletariat, and the hope is the advanced sections of the proletariat will be leading the way with the socialist theorist supporting them, and then the masses of proletarian coming along as this becomes successful. That was the idea in Kautsky and probably Marx. I mean, I don't think Kautsky pulled that out of his ass.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Kautsky famously said everything that he wrote was just synthesizing Marx and Engels.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of true. Although,
yeah, I'm not 100% bought in on that, but
there's a lot of Lassallean concepts that come into Leninism through Kautsky. So because of the synthesis, one of which is democratic centralism does not come, even though Marx was a centralist and a Democrat. Democratic centralism comes from the Lassallean side of the Marxist-Lassallean coalition that formed the SPD, not from the Marxist side. The Eisenkachers were not democratic centralists, which is interesting. Anyway, so the party remains a vanguard in that it believes that it can understand the long-term interests of the people better than themselves because of their theoretical socialist apparatus, but that it listens to the people and how to do this and takes particular situations seriously. Because the other thing that they critiqued the Soviet Union for was not listening to local conditions. So there's that. Now, let's get into the history of this, because the mass line is interesting. It's actually been revitalized under Xi, which is something we could talk about.
Yeah, he's revitalized the United Front work as well, which is not, the United Front work is not a united front. It's different, but it's also part of the mass line process that was kind of until through like Deng. I think through Deng was like fairly, like, it wasn't really doing much, and then Xi has kind of like revitalized that through the Four Principles and everything.
Yeah, after Deng, you had, like, for example, you had formal freedom of speech in communist China until Deng. I know people are often surprised by this, but like Deng actually is one of the people who suppressed, like, made certain speech acts more illegal than others.
A very liberal reform, I would say. That's a joke. Yeah. That's a joke. I need to.
He also got rid of stuff like the education of rural girls. But anyway, see Mobo Gao and Dong Ping Han for discussions of that. And by the way, actually read some Chinese scholars from China on this. Don't just read whatever. I mean, I am going to create a corresponding study guide for this. It's going to include all kinds of sources, but
yeah, if you have access to like English translated like Chinese scholars, or you speak anything, or you have
yeah.
access to a
Dear God,
friend
if you
who's a
speak
Chinese
Mandarin,
speaker,
yeah.
yeah, like do that. The amount
All
of
right,
stuff
so let's
that's
talk
being
about the mass lines history, because this is fascinating, weird shit. So, in the 1920s, the first United Front goes tits up. I don't really know how to explain it. The right of the Kuomintang suppresses the left of the Kuomintang, and then massacres the CPC, which also leads to Chindu Shu being discredited because he becomes the fall guy for that, because he was the person enforcing the Comintern's line in the party, which creates a space for Mao to come up because the other founder of the CPC dies before this happens. I gotta remember that guy's name. We'll look it up in a second, because he's a proletarian nations guy other than Mussolini, and he's actually kind of weirdly fascinating, but he doesn't live very long. So let me actually look it up. And when people say the founders of the Chinese Communist Party is Mao, they're just wrong, just straight up wrong. Who's the founder?
Li and Chen.
Li Das How, I think is how you might say that. I don't know. I'm not good at pinyin transliteration, so but Li Das How and Chindu Shu is the other one.
Mm-hmm.
We've already talked about Chindu Shu. Anyway, there's the current standing committee, of which anybody seems to only know Xi Jinping. They don't know the other ones like Chao Li-jie or Wang Ning or Kai Ji or Ding Shu Shang or Li Ji. Like, I'm just going through the standing committee as it exists and butchering all their names. Sorry, Chinese speakers. Now you know what the French speakers feel like when they listen to me. Anyway, I do think it's interesting how we don't focus on any of those divisions or what. It's hard to know. I mean, honestly, if you're not in the party and read Mandarin, you kind of don't know this stuff. And the other thing I will say is, because of the mass line, even though it is democratically centralist and has a strong central government, local conditions and provincial authorities actually much stronger in China than it was in the Soviet Union. So there are massive differences between the autonomous prefectures and the various provinces than there were than the same conditions in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. There are some, like, I remember reading a couple things about how, depending on like the locality that you're in, even just some of the alliances or compromises that the Communist Party is willing to make when it comes to that local management is going to be different.
Yeah.
And like just depending on the different class makeup of those like different rural provinces, even if they're very close to each other.
Yeah.
Which is a flexibility that you just don't have on other experiments.
No, and one of the things I think about the mass line is it is unique to Maoism, but Maoists aren't the only people who use it. Marxist Leninism, Ho Chi Minh thought, uses a mass line justification, even though they are pretty damn anti-Maoist. They haven't forgotten Cambodia. They're Guevarist, not Maoist, but did also use mass line logic. Again, though, you tend to see this in places that are not super industrially developed. Because what makes the mass line different from the merger thesis? The inclusion of the peasantry, and some forms of the petite bourgeoisie, and even sometimes, like I said, in Jusei, which doesn't follow mass line, but there are some other countries that do, where the ex-Confucian intellectual are considered a valid class because they've been thrown out of feudal order and brought in as part of the leadership. And this is what makes Asian Marxism so different in a lot of ways than Soviet Marxism, and they're both different than quote unquote Western Marxism. And before you get all on to me, by Western Marxism, people, I just mean Marxism not in the Soviet Union and not in Asia. Like,
yeah, the existence of an actual like intellectual class, like intellectia, not even that, but just one that was a ruling class at one point in a history that could be like remembered, it just changes things dramatically. Where I mean, Lenin talks about like the intellectuals being the shit of society and or the shit of culture, not the producers of culture. But
right.
This is just like not the case in a society where the intellectuals are an actual class.
Although when I always talk about this when we talk about Lenin, because Lenin's talk about the intellectual class is the intellectual servants of the Tsar. That's who he means. He does not mean white collar workers. He means
that's
actually
that's a good distinction, actually.
Yeah, he means like, because people get this all confused, like because they'll read like Lenin and they think he's talking about the PMC. No, he's not. He's talking about the minor courtiers who have the ability to be scholars because they are supported by the Tsar. Whereas in the Confucian tradition, these people were the aristocracy. They weren't just servants of it.
Exactly.
And that's got an interesting problem. And one of the things about Maoism that's of great debate is how much legalism and Taoism and Confucianism, even though Mao is okay. So during the Hu Jintao period, and there's less of this in the Xi Jinping period, but you still see it. You'll hear people argue about how Confucianism was necessary to build the collective culture to make communism uniquely flourished in China and almost make communism a national character argument. I just want to point out Mao would have shot you for that. Because the Cultural Revolution was about breaking the backs of the Confucian intellectua, and the urban elites. That's what it was aimed at, which was not a bourgeois problem. It whether or not it worked is up for debate, but
it does seem like the power of Confucianism has ebbed and waned in recent administrations. I don't quite know how to describe the leadership structure, but I'm going to call them administrations.
Yeah,
they're different governments.
The Politburo of the different, administrative secretariats. The one thing that's happened under Xi is positions that were distinct even under Mao. Like, for people who don't know, usually it's the party secretary who has the most power in an actually existing socialist country. But there are presidents and shit. Like, the president of the Soviet Union wasn't the people that you think of as the leaders of the Politburo. Like, and people always forget that. I'm like, no, they had presidents. They weren't that important, but they had them, and they did do some things. And for example, like in like the premier versus the president was a distinction prior to Xi in Chinese government, and under Xi they've been consolidated. So, but like Zhou Enlai had a lot of damn power under Mao. It was often, Mao's enforcer, but also his counterweight. But anyway, back to this. So, in the Hunan report, which is the report on the investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan, which is like one of the first Maoist documents. It's all Maui. You have the beginnings of the process that leads to the mass line, which was actually going out and looking at the conditions at the time. And if you wonder where he might have got this idea from, think about the conditions of the working class in England written by Engels, and think about the directive given by Lenin. So this is not far into Marxism, to go out and like, what are they actually doing? How is the working class and the peasant class actually living? And in the Hunan report is where Mao argues that because of their particular situation in China, the poor peasants were going to be a more revolutionary force than the urban proletariat because the urban proletariat was underdeveloped. There is still a classical Marxist argument kind of here a little bit in early Mao. I want to be very clear on that. We can argue if it stays there, but you know, for people who listen to me, I'm not a Maoist, but I'm actually I actually will kind of intellectually defend like some of the Maoist moves and why they developed the way they did. I'm always like, okay, but we don't have a peasantry anymore, so I don't see what the point about this stuff
Yes,
is.
that is a big thing.
And this broke with particularly the 1930s Stalin line about the peasantry. Now there was still a consideration of the petite bourgeoisie and the landholders, and like there was even lines like you had so many hectares led to like you being a different class of people. Like they got very specific. I don't want to sound like all the peasants were okay, but you did not have massacres of peasants of like large landholding peasants unless they were also massive landlords.
Yes, that was the distinction for sure.
So you didn't go through dekulakization and have like a mini civil war trying to break the backs of your peasantry. And the other thing that Mao did is even though they had collective agriculture was done on local conditions and not imposed from the top, which I do think is why collectivization did not, even though it often failed during the Great Leap Forward, it was not unpopular. You didn't have peasants like sabotaging the mission the way you did in the Soviet Union. Because local conditions were considered a lot more. And I could go into the what this means about the interpretations of democratic centralism and central organization. But basically, even though the CPC is still centralist and believes in central organization, it is much looser in its organizational style than the Soviets were. Take of that what you will, but it seems to have worked out kind of to their advantage.
Yeah.
All right, so during the Hunan early period, you have this. Then you have the Jiangxi Soviet. I think I'm saying that right. I'm just going to spell it in English for people. I have no idea how you say this Mandarin. It's Jianjixi Soviet, which is a little later. And the party begins practicing workers' inquiry and investigative meetings to understand land ownership, peasant grievances, what level of landlord is the problem, how to survive KMT encirclement, providing tangible benefits to local supporters so they didn't defect to the KMT. This is where this really starts getting headway because they're really concerned about defectors because unlike in the Soviet case, I mean, yes, they suppressed the SRs and the other Narodniki and they fought the rights, but basically this was settled by civil wars and the peasantry more or less sided with the Soviets until they didn't. Whereas in China, but particularly leading up to World War II, you're dealing with multiple there's way more factions, so it's not just like the rights versus the West, and like there's a few blacks somewhere that no one cares about, unless you're one of those blacks. And by blacks we mean anarchist. In China, you have the warlords, you have the Kuomintang, you have the Japanese invaders, you have the foreign powers that are still trying to hold on to parts of the coastal provinces. So you have a much more complicated civil war, which is not to say the Russian Civil War wasn't complicated, but it did ultimately ended up with like two sides, basically. With like like we talk about the red Mensheviks and the white Mensheviks, which are the Mensheviks that went into exile but didn't really oppose the Soviets, versus the white Mensheviks who sided with the reactionaries, et cetera, et cetera. So the sorting isn't as clean in China. So keeping people loyal was more important.
This is also, I mean, it's so complicated, and I feel like people don't often like point this out, is that like there was a real possibility that Chiang Kai-shek would have allied with the Japanese invaders with like some kind of anti-communist agreement, and that was like a major reason that the KMT, like the Second United Front, formed, was to prevent that from happening in the first place, because it was just becoming such a real possibility that the Japanese and the KMT might form an anti-communist coalition.
Yeah, that bad. It was that bad. So then you have the Hunan period, which is the institutionalization of the party. But that, my friends, is the long march. Because at first, the CPC is way outnumbered by the KMT and gets their ass kicked multiple times. So they go out to the mountains and start institutionalizing themselves. And in 1943, during this period, you have a couple of resolutions. One is like the combat liberalism speech that everyone loves but doesn't understand.
Like most of Maoism.
But then you have the 1943 resolution, where Mao talks about the resolution on the methods of leadership. And you get the slogan of the mass line, which is from the masses to the masses. And he talks about two specific deviations. So normally we talk about right and left deviationism from the Marxist center. But Mao actually talks about specific deviations, which is commandism and tailism. Tailism is an old thing where you have incoherent policies, some of which are reactionary because the people like them.
Populism.
AKA populism. AKA policy mongering. AKA, and tailism takes both reactionary and progressive. Initially it meant also bringing up reactionary or anti-communist or or like socially conservative stuff into the movement. Mao, for example, was much more careful than Galonzo on like meeting with peasants and dealing with their sexism, but not like freaking them out. So I know that people don't like gradualism, but Mao is very much gradualism and the progressive role of women in the party. He's very pro women, but he was very gradual about it because he didn't want, like what sometimes happened to leadership who went to peasants in Peru during the Shining Path period and tried to preach gender equality to rural people, and they got themselves fucking killed. And then the party reprised and killed the peasantry in response, which led to reprisals and made the Shining Path kind of fucking unpopular. Mao didn't do that.
And again, this is a good example of the flexibility, because there were small towns where there were actually like members of the Chinese party, like Communist Party, who were women, who were in leadership positions. And then there were other towns like right next to them where that's not the case at all. Like that's not happening right here. That's not happening there.
Yeah, we'll get, the idea is like we'll get them there, but we're not starting there. We're gonna let these various areas come up as they need to come up.
Yeah.
The idea is we're gonna get them all to the same place, but we're not going to force them to pretend like they're at the same level culturally or developmentally right now. And you can tell I'm actually impressed by this in the history of China, because this is an issue in other places in the communist world. I mean, you want to see where this gets wild? Read the Second International debates about whether or not women should vote. It is not as obvious as people think. We only talk about the pro-women voting side of that debate. But it was not all pro at all. So anyway, then you had the rectification movement, which was an attempt to rectify the thinking of the urban intellectuals who had joined the party, but forcing them to adopt the lifestyles and perspective of the rural peasantry by co-living with them. This is going to come up again because this is where the rustification policies come from. And I know I am unpopular for saying this, but one of the things I admire about Maoism is forcing intellectuals and peasantry to live together and share skills. And everyone else talks about it like it's a tragedy, even other Marxists, even some people in China talk about it. But you will notice that it's usually from the perspective of the urban intellectuals.
Yes.
So anyway, so this happens in the Hunan period. This is a precursor to what's going to happen in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. This is in the mass line. All right. Do you disagree with anything I've said so far? We're about to get into the proper Maoist era. So
I don't think so. I think we've I think the only point of disagreement would have been if you disagreed with the intellectuals going to live with the rural people. I think that's really
I'm
important.
pro that.
I'm
as a intellectual who has lived in fucking bumfuck ass places.
It's important.
Yeah. That's why when everyone's like, why don't you live in New York? And I'm like, because I need to know how most people live.
I need to not lose my mind.
I mean, I don't have a problem with New York, but like, you know what would drop me to lose my? You put me in LA, I would go insane immediately.
What if New York but spread out so you have to drive everywhere?
Yeah, what if New York but no Fordist infrastructure, no manufacturing history, even though it's gone in New York too, and the dominance of the even lamer forms of finance and technological capital, that are even more rent-seeking but make up most of the economy. Yeah, that's gonna make me super fucking happy.
Yeah.
And then people who got rich off of land speculation, you know, like, and for those of you who will ever hear me talk about things, I'm gonna be very careful about this. But even as a teacher, when I've taught the rich land speculation wealth, those people are fucking awful. Like, not every one of them, obviously, but as a rule, when you encounter people who don't want to work but are super fucking privileged, either aristocrats or people who got lucky with land speculation, and it's because they don't know how to work, even by a bourgeois standard.
Yep, they don't even have the bourgeois like worker mentality.
Right. Like, they're not even like, they don't have the corporate mentality. Anyway,
they don't have the grind set even.
Right, it's bad. So, and the rectification movement was so that the urban intellectuals would skill, and this part of it's often missed, would skill the peasantry with ideas, but they'd also have to learn how to live with the peasants, learn their lifestyles, and actually know it by doing it, not just theoretically going about it. This was their critique of a lot of the SPD and even the Bolsheviks. They didn't go out and they didn't live with the people they were representing in a real way.
The SRs were the one who had to go to the people campaign, and granted, it didn't work because their entire thing was don't actually do any of the rural work, just tell the rural people what they're supposed to believe. But I mean, the Cuban literacy program did a similar thing as well, where teachers were sent out from Havana, lived in these towns, and then it wasn't just, I'm going to teach you how to read, it's you're going to teach me how to fish because you're a fisherman. And then from there, it was a skills trade.
By the way, in Latin America, the places that didn't have problems with vaccines during COVID were places where the nurses and doctors had actually done something similar and lived with the peasantry as parts of the community and not as a separate class. And so there's a lot more trust in them. Where that did not happen, you had the same results that you had in the United States.
And we're seeing a further breakdown in the United States because it's being like that stratification is becoming more and more apparent.
Yeah. Which, by the way, was one of the few positive functions of traditional Christianity in the United States, is that it actually encouraged class knowledge and some institutional responsiveness to each other that has been undone by everybody but like the largest Catholic parishes because of the extent of social atomization. I'm not saying that religion's good, but it actually did serve that function in the US, and it's gone now. Which, by the way, you guys are getting pure reactionary religion now because these religious people don't go to church. So they're not.
Yeah, it's just, it's vibes based. It's vibes based reactionary thought.
Which is remarkably easy to defeat in practice, but remarkably hard to get rid of because you can't just get rid of the institutions and promote it.
Yep.
So let's talk about the Maoist era, which is a period of what we might call high Maoism, or when Mao was most influential between 1949 and 1976. And you have basically three periods of this. The Great Leap Forward, which This was an attempt to use mass energy to bypass traditional economic laws, both communist and otherwise. The mass line was used to justify rapid collectivization and things like backyard furnaces and community factories that were built like, just locally. But it was really open to oligarchical capture within the party. Mao knew this. I mean, Mao was also, some more cynical people would say Mao was often good at playing the popularness off of these new oligarchs to make sure that he stayed in power. That's cynical. That's a cynical interpretation. I think the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, to be quite honest with you. That Mao probably really did believe this, but it did also happen to keep him in power, so whatever. But anyway, so you had the Great Leap Forward, which was an attempt to do this on like voluntaristic will. This is where the romantic communism you hear about in the 70s comes from, that if you just will it, they will come. I hate to tell you, but Dungism, and I have lots of problems with Dungism, and I think the death toll of the Great Leap Forward is overstated, but I don't go as far as Dong Ping Han and pretend like it's not serious, because I'm like, sometimes he'd be like, well, old people were getting sick and dying of malnutrition, but that's not starvation. And I'm like, yes, it is. That's a definition of starvation.
Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, I will say, however, that even during the Great Leap Forward, lifespans were increasing from the warring states / warlord period, which was real damn bad. I mean, if you like the 19th century for China, you talk about century of humiliation, and people are like, oh, the American century of humiliation. You have rebellions that kill like 20 times more people than the U.S. Civil War did, both in terms of absolute proportions of society and in terms of proportional numbers. Then you can talk about a century of humiliation, because that China had that multiple times.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, that it was bad. So yeah. The Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, the warlord period, like I think average lifespan was like 45. I mean, it was bad.
Just the fact that the Taiping Rebellion killed more people than like I think the United States has ever lost, like total, like
all wars together,
combined.
We haven't hit it. No. Like it's something like 20 U.S. civil wars, which is our bloodiest per capita war.
Yeah.
Because civil wars are like, and basically you have things that we call rebellions that were like full scale civil wars, if we're completely honest. So the Great Leap Forward may have been bad, but it was better than what came before it. And this is something that's like what I'm not here to say that like, oh, communist China, nothing ever bad happened. A lot of bad happened. I want to be very clear on that. But when people talk about this and they don't talk about what was happening in China before it, I think they're being dishonest. Because I'm like the death scales are astronomical during the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. It's like crazy.
Yeah, it's simply bad faith to pretend that like the Great Leap Forward was some kind of aberration, or something that wasn't even normal in certain circumstances.
One of the problems with China is that it's always produced more population than food, and that's actually still true. It's just got better ways to handle it now. China is not food secure. It's relatively and not energy secure. That's why they still do shit like store food, which we don't do. So anyway,
and they also have the largest energy storage right now.
Yeah, because but we just blew through ours.
Yeah, well, nobody has any energy storage at this point except China.
But anyway, then you have the Ford period, like the period in the 60s, which is like the 100 Flowers campaign near the anti-rightist campaign. I'm not going to go into that. That's an interesting period of Chinese history where I think there probably is some real criticism of Mao that needs to be done. And then you have the Cultural Revolution, which, by the way, I have the historically unpopular belief that looking at the class sections and the ethnic tensions that emerged out of the anti-riotist campaigns and out of the Great Leap Forward and even out of the 100 Flowers campaigns, I think the Cultural Revolution, as bloody as it got, avoided the Civil War. That's my personal opinion. There are a few other people who agree with me. The people who do the Great Proletarian Revolution, Cultural Revolution podcast agree with me. But in general, a lot of people think I'm crazy for saying that. And they're like, oh, the Cultural Revolution is ultra leftist. And I'm like, well, by ultra leftist, you mean actually tried to live by communist means and figure out ways of doing labor tokens and doing what was spelled out in Critique of the Goethe program. I mean, Gotha program. I always make it Goethe pronouns wrong. Then sure. But like, I think that they were actually trying. Now, I do think they failed. But one of the things that, you know, someone like Michael Sandel talks about cooperative spirit in China, he's worried about what happens when the last of the Cultural Revolution / Long March people are gone, because he thinks that the interclass solidarity might go away.
Oh, wow.
And he sees signs of that in the young. He talks about this in his book on meritocracy, and like, and that's probably why Xi has taken such an interest in returning to math line stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then you have the Cultural Revolution, which is he used the mass line to bypass his own government and party, which he thought had become bureaucratic and elitist and even capitalist rotor. And when people try to tell you that capitalist rotor was invented in the West, they are lying. It is a Chinese accusation. Just sorry about that. I know that I've seen that asserted in a couple of books recently that people took seriously. You can know nothing about Chinese history in the 60s and 70s and believe that. The reason why it was used in the West was the popularity of Maoism that was poorly understood. I mean, like, I will say that, like, French Maoism and American Maoism, and even to some degrees Latin American Maoism, the Latin American Maoists, they at least a lot of times did go to China and learn some shit, but like everybody else was like kind of going off a ring and a prayer and a couple of books. That's what they had. Like, you know, they have like, you know, the Little Red Book, and that's what you got. Anyway, so you have the Maoist area, you have the send down of the youths, which were sent to the countryside to learn from the masses, based off of the rectification movement. The rustification movement came from the rectification movement. Sometimes it was a punishment, other times it was just a way to get people to learn from the masses. And Xi comes from this. We don't have many long marchers left. I don't think we might not have any long marchers left. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think so.
But we still have the send down people left, and once they go, I don't know what we got, because I do think that's an interesting thing about China. And let's go. Well, let's talk about this. And then we have the Reform era, which is 78 to 2012, or as I like to point out, it's really 82. With the establishment of the new constitution and Deng becoming unquestionably in power. Deng did not come to power by himself in 76 after the removal of the Gang of Four. There's a centrist coalition that was really kind of didn't really do anything. They're often called the nothingist faction in retrospect. That Deng is able to actually use the left of the CPC to oppose to establish some more reforms. So basically you had these milquetoast centrist, I don't know, Chinese quasi Khrushchev Brezhnevites. They weren't Khrushchev Brezhnevites, they weren't coming from that tradition, but that's like their equivalent.
I think Ezra Vogel's Deng Xiaoping like biography goes into this a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And also some of the Chinese critiques, like the Left in China book by goes into this too. So So sometimes you'll like check an American source and it'll say like Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1976. Not really. He really consolidates power by 1982. That's when the new PRC constitution is established. That's when they declare the establishment of socialism and the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat, kind of, sort of, not really. Also, they declare the establishment of socialism, kind of, sort of, not really. And I say kind of, sort of, not really, because they also talk about the need for more socialist reforms to establish true socialism, which will enable us to establish communism. And sometimes it sounds like they're talking about it in millenarian terms, and we'll hit it like in 1,000 years.
The 1,000-year socialist project.
Yeah. Well, Mao sometimes sounded like that too, even in the late 70s. I mean, like, it's not just like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and those guys. I mean, it's like and Deng Xiaoping. It's pretty much like it goes back to Mao.
I do understand that to a certain, like, on one hand, socialism needs to be a real project, but it also needs to be an aspirational project. Like, I understand that, but it's difficult to put that into language and writing and constitutional forms.
Yeah. So you have the bureaucratization period, which is 1978 to 2012. I'm going to actually say the Deng reforms were also, they hit China really hard. The life expectancy freezes until the 2000s. So Chinese life expectancy just stops. It doesn't go down, but it plateaus during the 80s. So people are like, oh, it was so great in the 80s. If you were certain people. You also had stuff like, I mean, during this time period, you had the end of socialized medicine, which even though it was barefoot doctors, you had it. Even Amartya Sen says that the barefoot doctors, even though they were like doing stuff like inventing elements of traditional quotation Chinese medicine, they did actually have a positive effect in an increase on life expectancy. You know, even if their treatments didn't have a lot of science backing them up. So make of that what you will. That ends things like free education for rural girls goes away. Like when people talk about Deng introducing like neoliberalism, like, no, he goes further than the neoliberals do. He introduces massive market reforms and undoes a lot of traditional socialist programs in China to get a bunch of capital investment into China, which is important for what happened now. Basically,
I mean, these are things taken away that aren't like that are just starting to be reintroduced. Like in the last 2 years.
One of the things I've actually talked about is like the new Red New Deal, which was just like, we're going to do some social welfareism in China in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2022. This is still relatively new. Now, there were things like land reform during the Jiang Zemin period and Hu Jintao, where like peasants could buy their apartments, and so there's all this like wealth tied into former peasants and proletarian workers who now own their house. And like, believe it or not, you have more rights of home ownership in China than you do in the West. Like you can refuse to like move your house and a road be built around it.
There's some amazing drone footage of like these winding roads because a couple of people in these small like rural communities didn't want to sell their house.
Right. And there's like, believe it or not, there's not eminent domain. So like, China's weird. But when I say weird, it's just because it's had a different path of development from us. And for all the like state has infinite power thing, there is where they don't claim it. So anyway, so now in the other thing that happens during the early Maoist era and then is really brought back during the Dengish era, it's this focus on new democracy. Then Jiang Zemin expands new democracy even more to what's called the three represents, which means the professional middle class and entrepreneurs are now part of the mass line class formation.
Just bring all the bourgeois and just
which is where the millionaires and the party stuff comes from. I
do feel like this is where some more substantive critiques can come in.
mhm.
It almost like just from reading how the mass line works from the United Front to New Democracy, it seems that there was an attempt at a path that then was through like austerity measures and stuff was almost pulled back a certain ways, not all the way. Like again, China's on a different developmental trajectory than we are in some ways, but there is still it's starting to appear that like China's market mechanisms are functioning in a way similar to
They have a
how
business cycle.
yeah, there's a business cycle.
This
Yeah.
is so weird to me that people argue with me the most about China's capitalistness when they clearly have a business cycle. And I'm like, even if you don't think the Chinese state is capitalist, and I'm willing to argue that it's not, it is subject now to the capital markets in the same way every other nation is. BRICS hasn't undone that. They're
Yep.
just, they're the most productive. I mean, like, they're better at capitalism than the capitalists are. But
Yeah.
like, but nonetheless, like, it doesn't change, this fact. And also, I mean, we also have to deal with like class struggle in China is both real and both through the state and against it simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because of the increased inclusion of everybody into the mass line. So you have Xi Jinping, who's considered a centrist, comes to power, but he like kind of cuts off from this new neo-Maoist thing that's happening. Look at Bo Xilai and those scandals. And so in 2013, he introduces the So the first thing Xi Jinping does is the mass line Praxis education campaign, which is to quote Xi Jinping, look in the mirror, straighten their attire, take a bath, and seek remedies to local problems. Because there was stuff like the Foxconn suicides and Hu Jintao's promise of delivering like European levels of social democratic welfare was not delivered upon. Xi still is somewhat critical of doing that, actually, and we could talk about why and what we make of that. Some people think, I know some people in both the left and the right of like social democracy who actually think this is a problem, but nonetheless, like he is interested in the mass line campaign. He returned to self-criticism sessions, but without like, the lethality of Mao. Because we could talk about like when Maoism and the Cultural Revolution, one of the reasons why the death count was so high is the self-criticism campaigns often led to people committing honor suicide.
Yeah.
And in other places, like in the Red Army faction, it led to people killing each other. Almost barracks communism, catechism of a revolutionary, nihilist communism in Russia style, like I can never say this guy's name, like Niebdev and those guys in the 19th century.
I mean, there was a real chance at one point that Deng, he was doing some self-criticism, like that Deng was gonna die. Even though Deng and like Mao were very close.
Deng gets rustificated for his deviations from Mao, but he's not. And remember what I said, Mao criticized Stalin for killing too many comrades. You'll actually notice that a lot of Mao's opposition did not die. I mean, I do think there's some shitty stuff that happened. Like, I think what happened to Liu Shaoqi is like unnecessary and cruel. Which was like denying him his diabetes medication and letting him die in jail. But I don't think that was. I mean, like, just personally, I don't think that was necessary. I also think that like the weird tension between Mao and Lin Biao is like hard to like it. The argument is was it an accident or did Mao have him blown up? History seems to indicate that maybe Mao blew him up.
Yeah.
But in general, party members didn't get executed, and mass deaths tend to be more accidental or suicide based than mass execution based. I'm not saying there weren't mass
Yeah,
executions in China,
I,
but
I
it
will
was
say, yeah,
good.
there's a reading of the Cultural Revolution is just like when there's a massive change, like there's upswell of society, there's a terror. I mean, we saw it with the French Revolution, we saw it after the American Revolution.
Yeah, we saw it in
Like,
the Yuzhov China. I mean,
yeah,
arguably, like even if you are like an author Getty's like Sheila Fitzpatrick, like Stalin is not why the Yuzhov China is so bad, which I actually agree. Like Stalin's
mhm.
not the only reason why it was bad. Stalin didn't do much about it though. He just institutionalized it. And it did lead to things like people getting killed for reasons that had nothing to do
Mhm.
with what they were actually concerned with, because people started turning people over for like petty vengeance, anger at bureaucracy, getting back at your girlfriend, et
I mean,
cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
the numbers aren't necessarily the same, but even a post-Civil War and post the fall of Reconstruction, like that's objectively just a counter-revolutionary terror. But there are terrors that happen after these things, and I do think the Cultural Revolution, like my defense of the Cultural Revolution, is that it seems that they prevented what could have been more.
Yeah, it could have been a far worse terror, if not an outright civil war.
Yes, yeah.
In a civil war in modern China would have been one of the bloodiest affairs of modern history.
Hmm.
So okay. But you had the return of what democratic life meetings and self-criticism sessions, although they weren't nearly as dramatic as they were during the Cultural Revolution, or in some of them like more insane Maoist culty things outside of China. And you also hear about the digital mass line because they use social media and apps. Like they monitor it, and they monitor it for like state control reasons, but they also monitor it to figure out what people want.
Yeah,
So again, I'm not here to be pro or anti-China, but you guys might hear that I'm actually fairly impressed by Chinese communist history. In the Sino-Soviet split, I confound people because I internally agree with the Maoist on a lot of stuff. However, on what they did on the international stage after 1968, I side with the Soviets. So
yeah.
it's like
The critiques
yeah.
were right, but then becoming buddies with Nixon.
Yeah. And doing the Khmer Rouge to mess with the Vietnamese
Yep.
to get back at the Soviet Union. That's supporting Pinochet just to give the middle finger to both the Social Democrats and the USSR.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not something I'm. And also, I mean, you can go forward, backing the United States in the war on terror.
Yep.
Which they did. I know people like, oh, they have to. You could still see it like their lukewarmness to do a damn thing about Israel because Israel is a major technological trading partner, even though,
I mean, you can see
they're
it a little bit
good.
with Iran as well, where a lot of the push has been, all right, let's go to the table. Like I've seen a lot of leftists be like, why isn't China intervening in the like American aggression? And they've just intervened on the side of the US essentially. That was a
Yeah.
very like
Because even though they want to counterblock to the status quo and they don't seem to like Trump very much, they don't want it too soon.
Yeah,
And they don't want to do what the United States did and like become a currency hegemon and make it too expensive to produce anything in their own country since they're still subject to the global market.
exactly. They've seen what happens.
Right.
Granted, there were economists at Bretton Woods who said this was exactly what was gonna happen, but US wanted dollar hegemony.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, Keynes did that. That's what we wanted Bancor. Now, Bancor would have been in favor of the British Empire, but it also would have encouraged world peace. So I don't know how you want to, like it may have been cynical for the British to encourage, but also would have created a international currency so that national currencies don't do what they do.
Yep.
And I know I'm going to have some people like, well, currency is not real money. And then I have other people be like, oh, Marxism's wrong because currency is all that matters, depending on your interpretation of MMT theory. Neither one of us are the believers in either one of those things. Currency is partial money, but I actually will say, if you want to understand the global economy, you actually you study commodities and commodity development, not currency flows. Although currency flows are important. I'm just...
currency flows are downstream of commodity development.
Right. And you want to understand why this is important. Well, if you price U.S. growth in any commodity, I've tried it with gold, but you can do it with oil. You can do it in almost anything. Any commodity has a relatively stable price. American growth after 2019 just doesn't exist. It's all nominal. Now people say, oh, that's that all nominal growth is all that matters. I'm not sure that that's true, but we'll find out.
We're in the find out stage at this point.
So we are an hour and a half in, and we've covered the basics and basic history of mass line thought. I hope this corrects some people. It is pretty clear how this develops out of the Popular Front and the United Front, or the National Front. It's also clear that it actually, I think, innovates in some useful ways on traditional Marxism, but I also am going to criticize it for being way too expansive on what classes it includes in the mass line. And I do think this goes back to New Democracy. So let's actually talk about New Democracy.
We made it. We're an hour and a half in. We did it.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a long episode because we have to explain. I think unlike the Popular United Fronts, where we're covering more material, but it's also a simpler concept. It's like less specific. It's both less specific and more specific. It's weird in the United States because neither the Popular or United Front from above actually work because we don't have parliamentary coalitions.
Exactly.
So when we talk about the Popular Front, what we actually mean in the United States is liquidationism into the Democrats. And we talk about the United Front, we mean the United Front from below and working with non-communist unions. That's all we mean in the United States. But everywhere else, this stuff kind of works. Okay, so New Democracy. All right, New Democracy comes from Section 5 of On New Democracy. It's kind of funny that it comes that late in the text entitled about it. But let me explain it. And this is still used today. This is where some of the you guys know there are other political parties that are allowed in China to this day as part of both the United Front and New Democracy. They don't have any ruling power, but they do have advising consent and participate in the administration of various cabinet functions and this, that, and the other. It actually does matter.
Yeah, this is the deliberative aspect of the deliberative democracy that is China in a lot of senses.
Now, yeah, I mean, okay, so I'm just going to read the quote from this. This is from 1940. And I also consider this like Mao's dialectical incorporation of the Chindushu, like quasi-classical Marxist, almost Platonist Leninism, with Lee's national proletarian thought, because this is part of what, like, Mao doesn't pick up national proletarianism. I don't know. Maybe fascism scared him off of that. I have no idea if he even knew about Mussolini using those terms. But anyway, China. This is from this is from January 1940. China may now adopt a system of people's congresses, from the National People's Congress down to provincial, county, district, and township people's congresses, which is like the Soviets, by the way. And this is kind of what this is. With all levels electing their representatives to the government bodies. What makes it different from the Soviets is it's not just the working class. Soviets are workers only councils with representatives. But if there is to be proper representation for each revolutionary class according to its status in the state, a proper expression of the people's will, And the people. That's a phrase that I find interesting because Marx fucking hated that phrase. And I actually, you guys are gonna see me like, I kind of like the mass line. I'm gonna be a lot more critical in New Democracy.
Once you start referencing the people, that's when I'm also, I feel like I'm hypercritical of that kind of like populist move.
Yeah, I'm just like, who are the people? We are not one. Anyway, I may have entitled a book about that. A proper direction for revolutionary struggles and a proper manifestation of the spirit of New Democracy. Then a system of really universal and equal suffrage, irrespective of sex, creed, property, or education, must be introduced. Such is the system of democratic centralism. Now, Maoists put a lot of emphasis on the central, but they do believe in the democracy part. I really do believe they do. Now you might go, well, they're not a democracy. I'm like, well, they kind of are, they kind of not.
This is the hill that I'm going to die on, is that I think democracy is kind of a useless term at a certain point, especially the way that we use it in the English speaking world, because in every sense, Iran is a democracy just as much as the United States is a democracy, just as much as China is a democracy. It's just they're different types. And that's what we're actually talking about.
No, Iran is a Republican government that just happens to have a religious vanguard as the people deciding what the orientation of it goes. Whereas we have two bourgeois parties that do that.
Sometimes.
Yeah. And they're not that different. All right. Only a government based on democratic centralism can fully express the rule of all revolutionary people and fight the enemies of the revolution most effectively. Although one day I'm going to do a series on all the things that democratic centralism has meant, because I'm sometimes for it and sometimes against it, depending on how you define it. And we don't consistently define it even as Marxist. I think it's actually led to some like glaring errors, but I also will say that basically, if you believe that votes are binding and you're an organization and you believe that the organization, central government, binds the organization if it's voted on fairly and legally, then you're kind of a democratic centralist in the small d, small c sense.
Yeah.
So while I have critiques of certain elements of, quote, democratic centralism as it's been historically practiced, by that I mean stuff like we're going to do open votes and slate voting and all that shit. As far as like the basic idea that your votes are binding, I believe it. Like, I don't leave an organization just because the organization votes in a way that I don't like, unless I feel like it absolutely violates the spirit of what I believe in, and then I leave the org.
Totally. Like, yeah. Exactly.
And I have often left orgs. So, but you know, for example, like with the DSA, I've lost every damn vote that I've voted on in that damn thing. But I do more or less think that the org's resources should go where the democratic will is. I also think, however, that the democratic will is often limited to the popular perception in an organization. And that an organization, even the DSA, is actually a very small representative of a class, much less the masses, whatever the fuck that is. At least the Chinese defined it. So there you go.
No, we call a vote of 3,000 people a mass movement now.
Yeah. A vote of 3,000 people in an organization of 100K in a cut.
That was me doing air quotes. 100,000.
Yeah, 105. It really is 105,000 now, but it's like I got told the New York branch doesn't even have regular meetings. So, because it's too big. And I'm like, well, they should break up into smaller units, and they won't do it. I'm like, okay. Only the government based on democratic centralism can fully express the will of all the revolutionary people and fight the enemies of the revolution most effectively. I always hear this stuff, and I'm like, this is good rhetoric, but like, prove it though.
Yeah.
And I do agree that this is actually, I agree with this statement, except that almost every word of it is not defined. And I know people are gonna be like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, how do you define democratic centralism? Only a government based on democratic centralism can fully express the will of all the revolutionary people. Only a democratic government can express the will of the people involved in government. No shit. debatably, because there's oligarchical capture, but we can deal with that. But we're going to talk about that in New Democracy, because that gets brought up a lot. And fight the enemies of the revolution most effectively, except when they're inside the party, and Mao has to do something about that. There must be a spirit of refusal to be privately owned by a few in the government and the army. Because one of the things that another thing that makes Mao, there's a lot of things that makes Maoism different. We haven't talked to a lot of, like, I've defended the mass line. Primary, secondary contradictions unique to Maoism. And that actually makes imperialism more important than capitalism, and not an automatic development of capitalism, or a later development of capitalism. I am of the imperialism existed before capitalism, but it has, like all prior forms that exist in capitalism, a different meaning and rationale under capital. So talking about pre-capitalist imperialism as if it's the same thing as post-capitalist imperialism is highly distorting and misleading. But it is older than, I mean, it's probably as old as there's been states.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I mean, I would argue this, like, this is going to be my argument. It might be a little bit of a.
Well, the other thing that makes Maoism unique that you also see from the Soviets, but that Lenin warned against, is the standing army. Mao believes in a standing army. But then he actually had to form a counter army of the Red Guards to fight the standing army. Whereas Lenin says the goal, now he doesn't say we can do this yet, but the goal is that military should eventually not exist, and in an interim, when the people are found, should be done by universal militia. And that's also probably how you should do the police.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This has been a hot take since about 2020 for me. Is how to do police abolition, and it's everybody becomes.
You and I are on the
sortition.
Is you sortition the military into a local police force, and you have little universal conscription into everything, and it's got a limit of 4 years. Absolute limit of 4 years. I actually fear standing police more than I fear standing armies. But and people are like, well, you still have police. I'm like, yeah, I mean, we still have people with guns. So I just don't want a coterie of people that just have, like, carte blanche execution who don't come from the community. And I
don't want a pseudo occupying class that is
which is what police have been. Other forms of law enforcement, such as sheriffs, actually come from a different origin, but the constabulate, which is where the cops come from, people are like, oh, it comes from slaveholding. No, it's older than that. It comes from the occupation of Ireland. When the military got pulled out of Ireland, they created a constabulary, and then they brought it home. That's what happened. There was sheriffs who were basically tax enforcers, and they were basically local tax enforcers, and thus also their own form of policing. But they would hang a lot of people. I'm not going to say that they didn't. But they were actually sort of quasi-democratically appointed after a certain point, and also they have a different origin than the police do. Which is why we have both in the United States, somewhat confusingly. But anyway.
I was really quickly going to say that the imperialism question, this might be a hot take from me, but I think it actually comes from the agreement, the KMT-CCP agreement, where or the CPC agreement, where the Communist Party agreed to work to realize some of Sun Yat-sen's principles of nationalism, democracy, social welfare, and then to reorganize the Soviet area a little bit. And I think that united front work may have actually moved into the New Democracy framework a little bit.
Yeah, I just realized that we've been going for 2 hours. So we're not going to complete New Democracy in this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you back on very soon for recording. I won't release it so we can fully cover it. I just want to mention New Democracy is important to the NAS line because New Democracy is a block of 4 classes. The proletariat, which is supposed to be the leading force, the peasantry, which is the main force of the revolutionary energy, but not the leading force in New Democracy. So this is the distinction. that even though the peasantry is the most revolutionary class, it's not supposed to be in charge. Although it might be equal to the proletariat Maoism, and that's where things get a little bit iffy. Which also makes using Maoist and fully developed in the developed world kind of weird, because I'm like, okay, what protracted fucking people's war? That's another thing to think for Maoism. Are you gonna do when there's no fucking peasantry that isn't just a normal class war?
Yeah.
But anyway, then you have the petite bourgeoisie, which includes students. I don't know why, because they're not really petite bourgeoisie, but usually we just don't know where to put them. Intellectuals who are professionals who could sell their skills on the market. Now, that's different from the PMC, because the PMC today is largely salaried, which means they're actually been workified. They're beginning proletarianization, so that's different. And small business owners. And then the national bourgeoisie, who were capitalists, who were patriotic and opposed to fallen imperialists and comprador bastards, but we're still bourgeoisie, and this includes the big bourgeoisie. This is the most controversial element of New Democracy, and this gets expanded after Dung to even more people. This is why some people have said that Maoism degenerates into national Bolshevism, because it's class collaborationist, including with the bourgeoisie. Now, you can argue that this is happening, and Mao did, that this is happening in areas where you are overthrowing a feudal overlord, and you're trying to direct capital development as a shortcut while maintaining the communists in leadership. This is the same argument of like Bukharin in the NEP, actually. So it's not, I mean, Mao didn't like Bukharin, but Dung does, and I don't think it's completely because Dung's some kind of renegade. This is new because it's not parliamentarily capitalism, which is too weak to function. It's not mass democracy, and it's also, we're not going to have a separate period of capitalist development where they get to be in charge of the state. We're going to maintain this block and then phase capitalist out somehow that we never really talk about.
Like 2050, I think now, right?
Yeah, it gets pushed back over and over and over and over again. The other thing is, we talked about democratic centralism being super important to this. So they believe in universal suffrage for the revolutionary classes. So the comprador bourgeoisie are the only people who don't get the vote. They believe in centralized execution of the people's will, which must be followed by everyone. But back to the mass line, this is adapted for local conditions in every case. And then opposition to Western representative democracy as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which just exists to manufacture for the rich, whereas we have the rich in our coalition, but we control them, damn it, because they're good patriots. This leads to state ownership and private ownership in a hybrid economy. And state ownership for the CPC is very different than state ownership in the Soviet Union, particularly post-Dung. And this is where things get real complicated and where we might have some real criticism. But we're going to end that there, because otherwise we'll be here forever. So like and
6 more hours.
Hit the bell, and I'm going to recall this like the mass line and the beginnings of New Democracy, and then we'll do New Democracy as its own episode, and we'll return to the mass line in part 4 of our ever-going series. And then I think we'll probably start talking about populism, new populism, left populism, and then the left communist response. But you guys may have noticed that me and Brandon, I'm not a Maoist. I don't know if Brandon's a Maoist or not.
I'm not a Maoist.
But we're more sympathetic to this than people would expect us to be. Because it's still around.
It is an experiment that's ongoing, which is, I think, important.
Everyone else is like, the Soviet Union worked, and I'm like, but it doesn't exist anymore, so it didn't fucking work. And you can come up with like, this is why, and this is why, and this is why all day, and that's interesting and useful to do. Even, I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it, But at some reasons, I'm like, that's cope though, because like if anything can resist Leninism, and I'm like, well, I mean, it won, but also it lost.
Yeah, not anything.
Like, I hate to tell you, but the Russian Federation, despite what certain liberals and conservatives in America would try to convince you, is sure as fuck not the Soviet Union.
No.
There is some continuity, but that continuity is more in abeyance of everything that isn't continuous. Yeah. So we'll come back and talk about New Democracy in more detail. Just one of the people that had the basic outline of it. But I just realized that if I go now and we start a New Democracy and go into all the critiques and all the articles that were read, we'll be here for 5 fucking hours.
That's true.
We're gonna end now and see you soon.
See ya.